In the rotting heart of Red Hook's industrial waste yard at 3 a.m, a 37-year-old Mafia boss, who controlled half of Brooklyn's underground empire, lay dying beneath a mountain of soaked cardboard and rusted metal. His blood-stained Tom Ford suit worth more than most people's cars. A silver ring engraved with his family crest, still clenched in his trembling fist. 3 bullets had torn through him. 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the abdomen, 1 in his thigh. And the men who dumped him there had laughed, whispering that the ghost of Brooklyn would simply rot like the trash he was buried under. Then, out of the cold November drizzle, an old woman appeared, pushing a squeaky shopping cart piled with bottles and scrap metal. Her 64-year-old frame bundled in 3 layers of torn coats, her face weathered by 2 decades of sorrow she'd never spoken aloud. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one came to this stretch of Brooklyn before dawn except the forgotten and the invisible. But when her flashlight flickered across his bloodied face, she dropped to her knees so suddenly that her cart tipped over. And what she whispered next froze his dying heart in a way no bullet ever could. His eyes, gray and cold, the same eyes that had ordered the deaths of 20 men, filled with tears he hadn't shed in 20 years, because somehow, impossibly, this ragged stranger knew the name he'd buried with his past. "Don't cry, son. Mama's here. What happened to you?" Before we dive into this story, hit that like button, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that freezing Brooklyn night where an empire was about to crumble, and a mother was about to find the son she'd been searching for across 2 decades of silence. 8 hours before Hudson Wakefield's blood mixed with the rainwater of Red Hook, he was standing by the 3-meter glass wall of the penthouse on the 62nd floor of Park Avenue, looking down at Manhattan like a king surveying his kingdom. The city lights stretched all the way to the horizon, reflecting in his cold gray eyes as 2 faint silver streaks, while his right hand turned the weighty Mont Blanc pen that had just signed a $50 million contract with the Guadalajara cartel. It was the biggest deal of the quarter, enough for the Wakefield family to expand its cross-border shipping route through 3 more states. And no one in that room dared breathe too hard before he spoke. A single second of silence in Hudson's world could weigh more than a gunshot. Finn Barrett stood 3 steps away from him. His ash-gray suit fitted tightly over his broad frame, one hand holding an encrypted phone with a red light blinking across its surface, the face of the 42-year-old man hardening in the way only Hudson's closest confidant could recognize as a sign that something was wrong. When Hudson finally set the pen down and turned around, Finn needed only a single nod, and the 2 of them walked into the inner office, where the sound of jazz piano from the speakers was cut off with one press of a button. "There's a rat in the family," Finn said, his voice as low as gravel rolling along the bottom of a river. "The last 3 deals were all leaked to Sterling before we could move, and I traced it back to the last man who had contact with all 3. Hudson didn't ask who it was. He simply walked to the walnut liquor cabinet, poured a glass of 30-year-old Macallan, and lifted it into the light as though admiring a gemstone. "Bring him up here," he said. 15 minutes later, Desmond Kane, an underling with 4 years in the business, was shoved into the room by 2 guards, his wrists bound with telephone wire, his left eye already swollen purple from the moment they dragged him out of his Cadillac in the underground garage. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He only looked at Hudson with the eyes of a man who already knew how this would end. Hudson sat down in the leather chair behind his desk, turned the glass slowly in his hand, then slid across to Desmond, a photograph printed on coarse paper, a picture of the man's 4-year-old daughter playing on a swing in the yard of a house in Yonkers. "We know where she goes to school," Hudson said, his voice never rising even half a note. "We know which gas station your wife fills up at on Tuesday mornings." Desmond began to shake. Hudson took a sip of whiskey, set the glass down, and continued in a tone that was almost gentle. "You've got 30 seconds to tell me how much Sterling paid you, and I won't touch them. If you lie, I'll burn that whole house to the ground before sunrise." 28 seconds later, Desmond confessed everything, including the address of the suburban apartment where Von Sterling had transferred $500,000 in cash to him through 3 separate exchanges. Hudson gave Finn a nod. Finn led Desmond out. The elevator doors closed. Hudson rose, turned back toward the glass wall, looked down at the tiny stream of traffic on the avenue below, and thought about the dinner he was about to have with Von Sterling at Il Cardinale. He didn't know that in a matter of hours, the very encryption he had just used to punish a traitor wouldn't be able to save him. He also didn't know that Desmond Kane would never make it home, and that the cold gray eyes reflecting the city in the glass tonight would, before dawn, be drenched with tears over a pile of trash in Red Hook, under the trembling beam of a flashlight held by the last woman on Earth who still remembered his real name. Il Cardinale stood at the corner of Mulberry and Grand, a family-owned Italian restaurant that had been there since Prohibition, a place where New York Mafia families still kept the habit of meeting whenever they wanted to pretend no one was about to kill anyone. Hudson walked in at 9 o'clock that night, a black wool coat draped over his Tom Ford suit, the silver ring engraved with his family crest catching the light beneath the crystal chandelier, with 3 bodyguards moving close at his sides in their familiar formation. Von Sterling was already seated at the innermost table, a 6-seat table that Mr. Carmine, the owner, reserved only for guests so important that even the mayor had to book ahead. The man was 45, his hair slicked back smooth with Italian pomade, his smile spreading wide as Hudson approached, both arms opening as if to welcome some distant cousin home. "Hudson, my boy, sit down. I ordered the 82 Barolo you like." Hudson sat, not taking off his coat, not returning the smile. The jazz piano from the corner of the room drifted by like cigarette smoke, Duke Ellington's in a sentimental mood, and the bottle of red wine rested between them like a sacrificial offering. They raised their glasses. They talked about Vaughn's nephew graduating from Columbia. They talked about the Yankees' miserable baseball season. They talked about everything except the $50 million deal that both of them knew had been leaked, and about the name Desmond Kane, which Hudson mentioned only once in the conversation, simply to see whether Vaughn's face might flicker with the slightest thing. Vaughn didn't flicker. He only smiled more broadly, poured more wine, and said, "Men who don't understand the value of loyalty deserve to disappear." 2014. Hudson knew right then that he was having dinner with a snake, and that this snake had already decided to strike. The only question was when. By 11 o'clock, when the last plate of tiramisu had been cleared away, Vaughn rose, clasped Hudson's hand hard, holding it 1 second longer than usual, and said, "Get home safe, my boy." Once they stepped onto the sidewalk, the November air bit at the skin like a blade. Finn had already lined up 3 black SUVs at the curb, a compact submachine gun hidden beneath his coat, his eyes flicking up toward the rooftops around them with the instinct of 10 years in the trade. The convoy turned onto Canal Avenue, heading for the Manhattan Bridge on the way back to Brooklyn, the streetlights streaking across the roofs of the vehicles like falling stars. Hudson sat in the back seat of the middle car, scrolling through messages from his lawyer about Desmond, when Finn, in the front seat, spoke 2 words into the radio, in a voice that had gone completely cold. "Stop now," but it was already too late. The concrete truck coming from the opposite lane didn't slow down at all before slamming into the front of the lead SUV with a sound that ripped the night open. And almost at the same instant, from 3 separate rooftops along the bridge, muzzle flashes began bursting like fireworks. The bullet-resistant glass of Hudson's vehicle shattered into a web after the first 7 shots, and after the 12th shot, it wasn't glass anymore. Gabe, the bodyguard behind the wheel, took a bullet through the neck and collapsed onto the steering wheel. The SUV crashed into the bridge barrier, spun sideways, and its red taillights bled through the gun smoke. Finn dragged Hudson down onto the floor of the vehicle and fired back through the shattered window, blood from his left shoulder soaking the sleeve of his coat. 3 other bodyguards were dead in less than 40 seconds. Their bodies sprawled across the seats like discarded dolls. When the car door was yanked open from outside, Hudson felt the first bullet punch into his shoulder, then the second into his stomach, then the butt of a gun slam into his face so hard the world tilted 60 degrees. Finn's voice was shouting from somewhere behind him, "Boss!" But that cry was swallowed by the wail of distant sirens. Before he lost consciousness completely, Hudson still heard an unfamiliar voice, thick with Brooklyn in every word, sneering by his ear. Boss Sterling said to let this one rot somewhere no one will ever look. And when the trunk lid slammed shut over his head, Hudson Wakefield's world sank fully into darkness. The 2-story wooden house of Margaret Holloway stood at the end of a dead-end lane, exactly 300 footsteps from the Red Hook docks, close enough that on windless nights she could still hear the horn of a container ship leaving port at 4 in the morning, and far enough that none of the scavengers ever imagined anyone lived there. The sea-blue paint on the outer boards had peeled away through 18 winters, exposing gray, silver grain like bone. The tin roof had been patched with 3 pieces of mismatched metal, and the eastern window, shattered by a fallen branch the year before, had been sealed by Maggie with nothing more than clear tape and a sheet of cardboard. She pulled the warped wooden door shut behind her, turned the rusted iron bolt, and only then allowed her 64-year-old shoulders to tremble. Hudson lay on the narrow bed in the back room of the house, the room that had once belonged to Henry, his blood-soaked Tom Ford suit cut away by Maggie's old fabric shears, revealing 3 wounds still oozing slowly through the towels she had pressed against them. He wasn't awake. He wasn't dead yet either. His breathing was shallow and broken, like a candle on the verge of dying in the wind, and every time his chest stayed still a moment too long, Maggie's heart seemed to stop with it. The room was small, just large enough for the bed, a pine wardrobe she hadn't opened in 20 years, and a rocking chair beside the headboard where she had sat every night through the first winter after Henry vanished, waiting for a knock that never came. She laid a damp cloth across Hudson's forehead, then stepped out into the sitting room, where the table lamp was already on, casting light over a space so simple it hurt. The little altar on the shelf by the wall held only 2 framed photographs, one of Patrick Holloway, taken in the summer when she was 30, back when she still believed he was a decent man, and one of Henry at 15, taken with an old Polaroid, the boy laughing in front of a Christmas tree in the blue sweater she had knitted for him. Before the 2 frames stood a weakly flickering electric candle and a porcelain bowl of water already half empty. In the kitchen corner, the 4-burner gas stove made in the 1970s clicked and snapped every time she lit it. The old General Electric refrigerator shivered beneath the hum of its tired motor, and on the wooden dining table sat a green plastic bowl with a little tomato soup left from supper. It was Noah's bowl. The boy was asleep on a mattress, laid on the floor in the corner of the sitting room, curled beneath a quilted blanket, his straw blonde hair in tangles, one arm still wrapped around the teddy bear with one eye missing that Maggie had bought for $3 at a flea market. 7-year-old Noah Holloway wasn't her grandson by blood. Only the child from the house next door, the son of Colleen Brennan, the neighbor who had died 3 years earlier on her kitchen floor with a syringe still stuck in her left arm, while the boy's father was serving 7 years at Attica for the same offense. Child Services had planned to take him into care, and Maggie, the scavenger woman, the woman who had nothing but a rotting wooden house and $600 in savings, had signed the emergency adoption papers on the very day the 4-year-old boy sat on her front steps and asked, "Grandma, do I have to go somewhere?" She gave him her last name. From that moment on, he was Noah Holloway. Maggie stood in the middle of the room, looking at the sleeping child and listening to the broken breathing of the man in the back room. The man she had spent 20 years searching for and less than 2 hours recognizing, and she knew she had to call the only person left alive in this world she could still trust. She reached for the old-fashioned landline hanging on the kitchen wall, turned each number slowly with trembling fingers, and prayed that Beckett Shaw would answer. Beckett Shaw picked up on the 4th ring, his voice rough with sleep after being woken at 3:40 in the morning. And when Maggie said only 3 sentences into the line, "Beckett, I need you here now. Bring your kit. There's a man dying in my house," the other end went silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then his answer came back in only 2 words, 30 minutes. She set the receiver down, stood leaning against the kitchen wall for a moment, and for the first time since she had found Hudson beneath that pile of garbage, she allowed herself to let out one long breath. Beckett Shaw, 65 years old, arrived shortly after 4, about 26 minutes after the call, wearing an old brown wool coat and carrying a black leather bag with the handle worn smooth, his face angular, his salt and pepper beard trimmed neat, and his tired blue eyes belonging to a man who had seen far too much blood in his life. He had known Patrick Holloway since 1990, when the 2 of them worked together at the Todd shipyard on Beard Street, Patrick as a welder and Beckett as the company physician, before he earned his surgical specialty. Her husband had left, and her husband's friends had drifted away with him, but Beckett had been the only one who came back to knock on her door in the spring of 2007, when she had just lost her teaching job, carrying a bag of groceries and asking no questions at all. She had never forgotten that. When Beckett stepped into the back room and the table lamp threw its light across the face of the dying man on the bed, he stood frozen for exactly 5 seconds, and the leather bag nearly slipped from his hand. "Maggie," he said, his voice dropping until it was almost a whisper, "do you know who this man is?" Maggie stood in the doorway, both hands clasped tight before her stomach, and all she did was nod. "This is my son," she said. Beckett closed his eyes for 1 second, his lips pressing together as if swallowing something bitter. Then he set the bag down on the chair and began to work. "Your son," he said while tearing open the wrapping of a morphine syringe, "is Hudson Wakefield. He's the ghost of Brooklyn. He's the man this whole city prays will never learn their name." Maggie didn't answer. She only stepped to the bedside, took Hudson's cold hand in hers, and said, "He's still my son, Beckett, no matter who he is." Out in the sitting room, Noah was still curled beneath the quilt, the one-eyed teddy bear clutched tight against his chest, and the steady sound of the boys breathing in deep sleep was the only thing in the house that didn't betray the urgency of this night. Beckett had dragged the wooden dining table into the back room, spread a sheet of plastic over it, and with Maggie's help moved Hudson from the bed down onto the table to serve as a makeshift operating table beneath the light of a 40-watt lamp. He administered anesthesia, disinfected the 3 wounds with medical alcohol and betadine, then started with the bullet in the abdomen first because that was the most dangerous one, resting only millimeters from the abdominal aorta. His hands worked with precision and patience, in a silence broken only by the sound of the metal forceps striking the porcelain tray and Maggie's breathing each time she passed him another piece of gauze. The first bullet, the abdomen. The second bullet, the shoulder. The third bullet, the thigh. 3 misshapen pieces of lead fell one after another into the tray like 3 heavy black seeds. 2 hours and 30 minutes later, when Beckett stitched the final suture into the wound on Hudson's thigh with dissolvable thread, his white shirt bore 3 dark bloodstains at the wrists and across the stomach. He washed his hands in the kitchen basin, dried them on a cloth towel, then turned back to look at Maggie sitting in the chair beside her son. "He'll live," Beckett said. "But there's something you need to understand, Maggie. You didn't save a man. You saved a target. The people who dumped him in that trash tonight wanted him dead. And when they find out he didn't die, they'll come back. And they'll have to go through you to get to him." Maggie only looked at him, and Beckett let out a long breath, as though at last he had set down a burden he had carried for far too long. "I've done this before," he said quietly. "For men like him, I swore I'd never do it again. But for you, I'll do it one more time." He picked up his leather bag, paused at the door, and spoke one final sentence before stepping back into the Brooklyn night. "Pray that the little boy sleeping out there doesn't have to pay for this, Maggie." 3 days and 4 nights passed inside the wooden house in Red Hook like a slow-moving stream of muddy water, and when Hudson finally opened his eyes at 7 o'clock on the morning of the 4th day, the first thing he saw was an old pine ceiling with dark brown cracks running along the grain, like the map of a forgotten river. The second thing he felt was the smell of chicken soup, simmered with onions and celery rising from somewhere at the end of the hall, a scent his body recognized before his mind could understand why. And the third was the sound of rain tapping steadily against the tin roof above him, the drops falling slow but persistent like the heartbeat of the house itself. The first instinct of a man who had lived 16 years in the underworld wasn't to ask where he was, but to find a weapon. His right hand slid beneath the pillow. Nothing. His left hand moved across the bedside table, touching a glass of warm water and a porcelain bowl holding a folded cloth. Nothing. He tried to lift his head, and at once a tearing pain ran from his abdomen to his shoulder, forcing him back down, cold sweat breaking across his temples, and for the first time he realized that 3 thick bandages were wrapped around his body, and beneath them he was wearing a blue-gray plaid flannel nightshirt he'd never worn in his life. Someone had changed his clothes. Someone had bandaged him. Someone was keeping him alive. The bedroom door opened with a soft creak, and Maggie stepped in carrying an old wooden tray with a steaming bowl of soup, a wooden spoon, and a neatly folded cloth napkin set on top. She wasn't surprised to see that he was awake, as if she had been waiting for this moment through all 3 days and knew exactly when it would come. She set the tray on the bedside table, pulled the rocking chair closer to the head of the bed, sat down, and said in the calm voice only mothers have after they've already cried themselves empty, "You're awake, Henry." The name fell into the air like a stone dropping onto the surface of a lake that had been frozen for 20 years. Hudson narrowed his eyes, his voice so hoarse and weak that even he barely recognized it. "Who are you calling?" "Calling you," Maggie replied, her voice never rising half a note. "Your name is Henry Holloway. I named you after your grandfather, the man who taught you how to ride a bicycle on this road when you were 5 years old." Hudson turned his face toward the wall and tried to sit up, his right elbow pressing into the mattress as his whole body trembled from the pain, his shoulder sinking, and he fell back onto the pillow with a groan trapped in his throat. "I don't know the man you're talking about," he said, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his cold voice. His body no longer allowed it its full strength. I'm not Henry. I'm Hudson Wakefield, and when I walk out of here, I'll repay you with more money than you've ever dreamed of." Maggie didn't react. She simply spooned up a little soup, blew on it to cool it, and lowered the spoon back into the bowl. Just then the bedroom door was pushed open gently, and a small head with messy straw blonde hair peeked inside, wide blue eyes looking straight at Hudson with the fearless curiosity of a child who didn't yet know how terrifying the world could be. "Grandma," Noah said softly, still clutching the one-eyed teddy bear. The bread's burned. Maggie turned, smiled, the first smile Hudson had seen on her face, and answered in a warmth completely different from before. "I'm coming right away, sweetheart." Noah glanced at Hudson one more time, gave him the tiniest little wave, and said in a voice sweet as candy, "Hi, mister." Then the door closed behind him. The whole room fell silent. Hudson didn't know why his chest suddenly felt unbearably heavy, and he didn't know why his eyes burned, either. And when Maggie turned back to him, she looked at him for a long time before speaking the final words of that morning. "You can call me ma'am. You can deny the name you carried until you were 17. You can walk out that door when you're strong enough. But Henry, out there someone wants to kill you, and I'm the only person left in this city who still remembers who you were before you became Hudson Wakefield." By that afternoon, when Maggie had gone down to the kitchen to prepare supper, and Noah was drawing pictures at the dining table in the sitting room, Hudson had regained enough strength to sit up against the headboard, and for the first time he had the chance to truly study the room that was holding him there. On the opposite wall stood a faded 3-tier wooden shelf, where a few old elementary school textbooks were stacked beside a stuffed bear gone flat with age, and on the bottom shelf, lying at an angle in a loneliness of its own, rested a brown leather photo album with a cracked spine. There was something in the way that album lay there, without dust, without anything covering it, as though it was still taken down and opened often, that kept Hudson from looking away. He pulled the blanket aside, lowered himself over the edge of the bed, and with his whole body trembling, he took 3 steps toward the shelf, his left hand gripping the wall to keep his balance. Then he took the album down and sank onto the wooden floor right there, because he no longer had the strength to make it back to the bed. The first page held a black and white photograph of a 5-year-old boy sitting on a red tricycle, grinning wide, his 2 front teeth missing, with the sea blue wooden door of this very house behind him when the paint had still been fresh. Hudson didn't recognize that child. He had killed that child 20 years earlier. He turned to the next page, a Polaroid of the same boy at 7, wearing a school uniform, standing beside a woman far younger than Maggie was now, her face not yet marked by the deep lines it carried today, and behind them was a sign that read, PS 106 Red Hook Elementary School, first day of school. Hudson turned the page again. The boy at 10 with one arm in a cast, smiling crookedly. The boy at 12 standing beside a Christmas tree in a hand-knitted blue sweater. The boy at 15, his hair longer, his eyes already holding the distance of a child calculating a way to run. And then, tucked between the photographs and clipped together with rusted paper clips, there were other papers. The first was a missing person notice printed on a yellowing sheet of A4 paper, Henry at 17 in the middle, the name Henry Thomas Holloway, height 5 feet 9 inches, brown hair, gray eyes, missing since October 19th, 2006. The second was a receipt from Donovan and Sons Private Investigations in Bay Ridge, $200. Note: investigation in the Philadelphia area. The third, another receipt, $300, Newark area. The fourth, a reply letter from St. Vincent Orphanage in New Jersey, stating that they had checked their records and found no match. The fifth, a letter from Rikers Island. The sixth, a letter from the New York Police Department. The more pages he turned, the more Hudson's hands shook, and when he reached the 23rd sheet, he stopped because he couldn't bear any more. Those papers kept going, packed through the entire rest of the album, like the diary of a woman who had spent 20 years doing nothing but searching for her son. When Maggie appeared in the doorway carrying a hot porcelain mug, she saw Hudson sitting on the floor with the album open in his lap, and for the first time in 3 days, the ice had gone out of his cold gray eyes. "You looked for me," he said, his voice breaking at the final word, "for 20 years. Maggie set the cup of tea down on the floor, lowered herself to sit across from him, and folded her weathered hands on her lap. "I was an elementary school teacher at PS 106 for 22 years, Henry. After you disappeared, I couldn't teach anymore. I couldn't watch 17-year-old children walk out the door without wondering where you were, whether you were alive or dead. whether you were hungry, whether you were cold. I left my job the following spring. After that, I did whatever work I could. Cleaning houses, washing clothes, scavenging, just to pay detectives and keep this house. Because I was afraid that if one day you came home, you wouldn't know where to go. Hudson looked down at the album, and for the first time since the night he stepped into Sebastian Wakefield's black car, he spoke the truth. I ran because I hated being poor, Mom. I hated the smell of kerosene from the heater. I hated breakfasts of white bread spread with grease. I hated that you patched my clothes with thread that didn't even match. I thought if I stayed here, I'd die like a rat in this house. Maggie didn't cry. She only looked at him for a long time, then said the sentence she had rehearsed in her mind for 20 years without knowing how many times. And now, have you found what you went looking for, Henry? Maggie's question hung in the air between mother and son for a long while, and Hudson couldn't answer, because the only answer he had would force him to look straight at a truth he wasn't ready to face. Maggie rose, rested her hand on his head for the briefest moment, then left the room, and when she returned, she was carrying a small oak box about the size of a thick book, with the letters H.T.H. carved into the lid by her husband's dull chisel 36 years earlier. She sat down on the edge of the bed, placed the box in her lap, and looked at it as though she were looking at a grave that had finally come time to open. "There are things I should have told you a long time ago, Henry," she said softly, "but I was afraid. I was afraid you'd grow up with a heart full of hatred. And now I realize my silence hurt you even more." She opened the box. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a black ribbon that had long since faded, at least 30 stamped envelopes with no postmarks, and a blue-covered Chase Manhattan Bank passbook yellowed at the edges. Maggie picked up the top envelope, turned it over in her hands, then spoke without looking at Hudson. "Your father didn't die, Henry. Patrick didn't die in a factory accident when you were 4. Patrick ran off with a woman named Annalise, an accountant at the shipping company next to the shipyard, and he left me $320 on the kitchen table with a note saying he couldn't afford to keep the two of us." Hudson lifted his head, and for the first time since he had woken, he wasn't a mafia boss anymore. He was only a 4-year-old boy hearing that his father had left him all over again. "I lied to you," Maggie went on, her voice steady, though every word seemed edged with a wound. "I said he died because I didn't want you growing up hating a father who had abandoned you. I wanted you to keep a good image of him, even though that image wasn't real. I wrote 34 letters to him in the first 3 years, sent them to every address I could find, but I never mailed them, because I didn't want him to come back. I only needed to write them to keep myself sane. This is all that's left." She handed the stack of letters to Hudson, and he took them in the same hands that had ordered the deaths of 3 men in the past 4 weeks, but were trembling now like the hands of an 8-year-old child receiving a Christmas gift. He opened the top letter. Maggie's handwriting was small and neat. March 24th, 1993. "Dear Patrick, today Henry asked where his father was, and I told him his father was away on business. He is 4 years old. He doesn't deserve to carry this lie all his life." Hudson folded the letter shut. He couldn't keep reading. Maggie picked up the passbook, opened it to the final page, and turned it so he could see. "This is why I scavenged, Henry." On the last line, the balance was written in faded blue ink, but it was still clear. $47,082.53. 18 years, Maggie said. "Every dollar I earned beyond rent and food, I put into this account. I saved it so you could go to college. I thought you'd go to Brooklyn College, maybe study architecture, because when you were 8, you used to draw houses on newspaper. You disappeared when you were 17. I kept saving anyway, because I believed that if you ever came back, you'd need it, even after I turned to scavenging just to survive. Even when I couldn't manage 3 full meals a day in the winter of 2003, I never touched this account. It was always there, Henry. It has always been there." Hudson stared at the number, $47,000, less than 1,000th of the money he had moved across the Mexican border the week before, less than the price of the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, and he couldn't say a single word. He only set the album down on the floor, took his mother's weathered hand in both of his, and pressed his face into it. Maggie bent down and kissed his hair, and for the first time in 20 years, Henry Holloway cried without a sound like a 4-year-old child who still couldn't understand why his father wasn't coming home. Hudson didn't cry for long, because men like him weren't allowed to cry for long, not even when their world was collapsing from the inside out. He lifted his head, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and looked at his mother with eyes still red but already sharpened again by clarity. And he understood that if she had opened her box for him, then it was his turn to open his own. "Mom," he said, his voice rough. "There's something I need to tell you, and when you've heard it, I don't know if you'll still want to sit in this room with me." Maggie said nothing. She only pulled the rocking chair closer and sat down, her hands folded in her lap as though she were ready to receive whatever was coming. Hudson took a long breath, stared into the space between them, and began. "The night I ran away," he said, "I didn't leave alone. There was a man waiting for me at the corner of Van Brunt and Coffee in a black Lincoln. He said he'd seen me at Ferdinando's for 3 weeks straight, watched me washing dishes for $2 an hour, watched me stuffing leftover bread into my pockets to bring home. He said his name was Sebastian Wakefield, and that he wanted to give me a different life." He stopped, and Maggie raised her head slowly, as though someone had struck her from behind. "I believed him," Hudson went on, "because he knew my name, knew the address of this house, knew what school I went to. He took me that very night to a mansion on Staten Island, gave me a room of my own, fed me steak for the first time in my life, and after 3 months he started teaching me how to count money, how to read contracts, how to read people. After 5 years, he changed my name from Henry Holloway to Hudson Wakefield, and he told me I was his legal adopted son, that I was the sole heir to his family. I believed in him the way a son believes in his father. When he died of cancer 5 years ago, I took over everything he left behind, and I built that empire as a way of repaying the only man I ever thought had chosen me." Maggie didn't breathe for 7 seconds. Her hands tightened in her lap until her knuckles turned white, and when she opened her mouth, her voice was no longer calm. It was shaking. "Sebastian Wakefield," she repeated, then closed her eyes. "Henry, do you know who Sebastian Wakefield is?" Hudson looked at her, not understanding. "He's your uncle," Maggie said. "He's Patrick's younger brother. His birth name was Sebastian Holloway. He changed it to Wakefield in 1994, when he left Red Hook to join the real Wakefield family, after he was discharged from the Navy for theft." Hudson recoiled across the floor until his back struck the bookshelf, and his gray eyes widened so far that Maggie could see the ruin inside them. "Mom, don't say any more," he whispered, but Maggie couldn't stop now. "After Patrick left, Sebastian came looking for me," she said. "He came in March of 1993, when I was trying to find a second job to pay the rent. He said he would take care of me and you, that he had always loved me even before I married his brother. I turned him down, Henry. I threw him out of this house. I told him that even if I starved to death, I would never choose my husband's brother. He looked at me before he left, and he said, 'Any woman who looks down on Sebastian Holloway will pay with the most precious thing in her life.' 20 years, she went on, her voice breaking now, and the last 2 tears fell onto her hands. 13 years later, he took you. He didn't raise you because he saw you washing dishes. He raised you to punish me. That whole empire you have, Henry, everything you think is yours, all of it was built on a revenge plan that began when you were 4 years old." Hudson collapsed onto the floor, his shoulders shaking violently, and the sob he had held back for 20 years finally burst out of him like a dam splitting open. Maggie didn't say another word. She only slid from the chair, knelt on the wooden floor beside the son, who had lost himself to the curse of an uncle, who had never loved anyone but himself. And she held him as tightly as she could, as though she were trying to gather all 20 lost years into her arms. On the morning of the 6th day since the night at the Red Hook garbage lot, after Noah had left the house at 7:40 in the morning to walk to PS 106 Elementary School, 3 blocks away with his Spider-Man backpack over his shoulder, Finn Barrett was sitting inside a black Ford Explorer parked in the empty lot across from the 7-Eleven on Van Brunt Avenue, his eyes bloodshot from 3 sleepless nights, and the wound in his left shoulder beginning to fester beneath the hastily wrapped bandage. It had taken him 4 days to track this place down. 4 days of going through hospitals across the city without finding any record of Hudson. 4 days of bribing precinct officers for copies of traffic camera footage around the Manhattan Bridge and the surrounding Red Hook area. And in the end, it was the old security camera from this very 7-Eleven, catching an elderly woman pushing a shopping cart piled high with scrap out from the direction of the garbage lot at exactly 3:42 in the morning that night, with something beneath the tarp draped over the cart large enough to be a man's body, that had given him his lead. He followed the trail of the cart across 3 other cameras along Beard Street, And that path led him to the end of the dead-end lane he was watching now, to the 2-story wooden house with the peeling sea blue paint. Finn checked the Glock 19 beneath his coat, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the vehicle. When he knocked on the door at 9 o'clock that morning, it opened after 10 seconds. And the woman standing before him didn't seem surprised at all. She was wearing a gray sweater, her hands still in yellow rubber gloves from washing dishes, but the way she stood was straight and steady, like a soldier who had been waiting years for this order to arrive. "How can I help you?" she asked. And Finn recognized at once that she was the woman from the camera. "I'm a friend of your son," he replied, his voice low. "I need to see him." She didn't blink. "My son doesn't have friends in that world," she said. And she pressed the words "that world" in a way only someone who had seen that world up close could. Finn was about to answer when he heard limping footsteps from inside, and Hudson appeared at the end of the hallway, one hand braced against the wall, wearing the gray sweatshirt Maggie had bought for Patrick 30 years earlier but had never given to her husband. "Let him in, Mom," Hudson said. Maggie stood still for exactly 2 seconds, then stepped aside to make room, though her eyes never left Finn as he entered the house. He sat down in the old armchair in the sitting room. Hudson sat opposite him in the swivel chair Maggie had brought out from the bedroom, and Maggie remained leaning against the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, with no intention of leaving. Finn looked at Hudson like a ghost that had just stepped out of a grave, and when he opened his mouth, his voice broke. "Boss, I thought you were really dead. We went to identify bodies at the morgue for 3 straight days. I drank in the car every night, and thought I was the only man left in the Empire who was still loyal." Hudson only nodded. "Tell me the situation," he said. Finn swallowed hard. "Vaughn has taken the northern route," he said, "from Port Newark to Yonkers. He's bought off 3 of our 4 captains in the last 2 days. Marcus Whitlock, Joey Pellegrino, and Dante Rossi were shot dead in the last 24 hours, and their bodies were dumped outside their old clubs as a message. The rest are waiting to see whether you're alive. If you don't show yourself within the next 3 days, the Wakefield Empire will officially belong to Sterling." Hudson closed his eyes, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of the chair. He said nothing for a long while, and Finn waited patiently, because he understood that his boss was calculating. When Hudson opened his eyes, he turned toward the kitchen doorway, and for the first time he spoke in a voice Finn had never heard before. Not the voice of a Mafia boss, but the voice of a man making the most important decision of his life. "Finn, I need you to do 2 things. First, bring 4 of the most trustworthy men here and secure the perimeter around this house. No one is to step inside. Second, you need to understand that this house isn't a Wakefield family base. This is my mother's home, and if a single drop of blood falls on these wooden floors, I'll deal with that person myself, even if it's you." Finn looked at Hudson, then at Maggie, then back at Hudson again, and slowly rose to his feet, placed his hand over his chest, and bowed his head in the way senior members of the family reserved for only one man. "Yes, sir. I understand." When Finn stepped out the door and the Ford Explorer rolled away from the lane, Maggie still stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, and when she turned her head back, she saw that the son she had lost for 20 years was looking at her with an expression she had never once seen in all his life, the expression of a man who had just realized he had his mother back. That same afternoon, in an office on the 17th floor of Sterling Holdings overlooking Bryant Park, Von Sterling was leaning back in a burgundy Chesterfield leather chair, a glass of 25-year-old Macallan in his hand, and a Cuban cigar resting between the fingers of his right hand, when his assistant, Ray Malone, walked in with a face so drained of color that Vaughn knew at once the news coming wouldn't be good. "Boss," Ray said, stopping 3 steps from the desk like a dog that had learned that line was where safety began. "We've got a problem. Hudson Wakefield is still alive." Vaughn didn't react immediately. He only swirled the whiskey in his hand, watched the amber liquid cling to the crystal, and took a small sip before setting it down. Ray waited, sweat already gathering on his forehead even though the air conditioning was running. "Go on," Vaughn said. "Finn Barrett showed up in Red Hook this morning," Ray replied, "and our men watching him saw him enter a wooden house at the end of the dead end off Beard Street. He stayed there exactly 19 minutes, then came back out. Half an hour later, 4 black SUVs from the Wakefield crew arrived and sealed off the house. We believe Hudson is inside." Vaughn set the cigar down in the crystal ashtray, and for the first time in 10 minutes, his smile disappeared. "Who was in that house before Hudson got there?" he asked. Ray glanced at the paper in his hand. An elderly woman, 64 years old, named Margaret Holloway, a former elementary school teacher, currently making a living by scavenging. She lives alone with a 7-year-old boy she adopted. No known connection to the Wakefield family in any records we have. Vaughn went silent for a long time, and that silence made Ray stop breathing. At last he rose, walked to the window overlooking the park, and said in a voice soft as velvet and cold as a blade, "Margaret Holloway. Ray, I want every file on this woman on my desk in 3 hours. I want to know where she was born, who she married, whether she had children, and where that child is. And I want 3 teams on the road to Red Hook tonight. No action, only surveillance. If Hudson is really hiding in the house of an old scavenger woman, then we're looking at a gift I don't intend to unwrap too quickly." When Ray left the room, Vaughn turned back to his drink, and for the first time in many years, his smile took on the shape of a man who had just caught the scent of blood in water. 12 miles to the south, inside the wooden house in Red Hook, time was moving to an entirely different rhythm. It was already 9 o'clock at night. Noah had brushed his teeth and climbed onto the mattress in the sitting room with his one-eyed teddy bear, his straw blonde hair still damp with water, and Maggie had read him exactly 1 chapter of Charlotte's Web before he drifted to sleep with a small smile on his lips. Outside the window, 2 of Finn's men stood guard beneath the oak tree, their figures blending into the dark. Maggie stepped into Hudson's room carrying a tray with ginger tea and 2 butter cookies, set it down on the bedside table, and lowered herself into the rocking chair beside the bed the way she had done all week. Hudson was propped against his pillows, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and when she touched his forehead to check for fever, he lifted his gaze to her. "Mom," he said, "this scar on my collarbone, where did I get it?" Maggie smiled, a small smile that held all 27 years of memory inside it. "Don't you remember?" she replied. "You fell from the 2nd floor staircase down into the hall. You were 10, chasing the stray cat you'd hidden from me because you didn't want me to know you'd been feeding it in the attic. You slipped on the 3rd step from the top and slammed your shoulder into the banister. I took you to the emergency room at Long Island College Hospital, and the doctor gave you 7 stitches. Hudson closed his eyes, and the memory came rushing back like an old film he hadn't watched in years. "Do you remember?" Maggie went on. "That night you were so frightened you couldn't sleep, and I sat by your bed singing the song your grandmother used to sing to me." Hudson didn't open his eyes, but his lips moved. Maggie began to sing softly, her voice rough but warm. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." And Hudson heard every word like a voice returned from the dead. When the song ended, he opened his eyes, and 2 tears slid down across his temples and settled into the pillowcase. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." Maggie only bent down and kissed his forehead the way she had kissed it every night through the first 17 years of his life, and she whispered, "Go to sleep, Henry. I'm here now." Outside the window, in the darkness of the lane, a black car from Sterling's crew rolled slowly past the mouth of the street, with its headlights off, and the eyes of the man behind the wheel were recording every light still glowing inside the wooden house. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, when the November sun had already sunk early behind the warehouses across the harbor, and the sky over Red Hook had turned the color of lead, Hudson sat up in bed and called Finn into the room. He had felt it at lunch, that sensation any man who had spent 16 years among blood and guns could never mistake. The feeling that the air around him had suddenly become too quiet. Finn stepped in, and Hudson didn't need to say much. "They're coming tonight," he said. Finn nodded. "We've seen 3 unfamiliar cars pass through the lane in the past 2 hours," he replied. "I called in 2 more men, and I've placed a rifle team in the attic of the house across the street." Hudson shook his head. "Not enough," he said. "But more important than that, Noah can't be here tonight." At 5 o'clock, Maggie helped Noah into his coat, slipped his Spider-Man backpack over his shoulders, and tucked inside it the one-eyed teddy bear along with the half-finished copy of Charlotte's Web. The boy didn't understand what was happening. He only looked up at her and asked why he had to go. Maggie smiled at him with the kind of reassuring smile only a grandmother could give, and said, "You're going to sleep at Aunt Dolores's house tonight, sweetheart. I'll come get you after breakfast tomorrow." Dolores Kavanaugh was Maggie's closest friend for 32 years, a 68-year-old woman who lived alone in a small apartment in Park Slope, exactly 30 minutes from Red Hook by car. Finn had sent 2 men to shadow the taxi and make sure no one followed it. When Maggie bent to kiss Noah's forehead at Dolores's apartment door, She held his hand 1 second longer before letting go, and she said, "Sleep well, my boy." Noah waved goodbye to her through the taxi window as it rolled away, and she sat through the whole ride back with her eyes fixed on the night outside, and not a single tear falling, because women who have lost a child once in their lives already know how to swallow their tears whole. At 1:58 in the morning, the wooden house was as quiet as a grave. Hudson sat upright on the bed in the back room, his back against the headboard, the Glock Finn had given him the night before, resting across his lap. Maggie sat in the sitting room in the dark, a sweater pulled over her shoulders, a mug of ginger tea gone cold in her hands. Outside the window, 2 of Finn's men stood guard, and 3 others lay on the rooftops of the neighboring houses with Remington rifles. At 2:01, the first bullet ripped through the air. The sitting room window shattered, and the mug fell from Maggie's hand to the floor, but she had already thrown herself down by reflex. Outside in the yard, gunfire erupted from all 4 directions as Finn's men clashed with 6 of Sterling's shooters in a short, savage firefight between the wooden fences. Hudson was out of bed before the second shot, his body holding only half the strength of the Mafia boss he had once been, but still enough to move. He crawled down the dark hallway, and by the time he reached the sitting room, everything had already been turned inside out. The front door had been kicked open, and 1 gunman in a black leather jacket stood in the middle of the room with a handgun pressed to Maggie's temple, his left hand locked around her throat, shouting something about surrender. Maggie didn't scream. She only looked straight into Hudson's eyes at the end of the hall, and she said in the calmest voice she had ever used in her life, "Shoot, Henry. If you have to shoot, then shoot. Don't worry about me." Hudson stood still. The Glock in his hand had already come up, but the 3 wounds still healing inside his body were crying out in pain. Cold sweat was running down his spine, and his hand was shaking. The distance was 4 meters. The gunman's head and Maggie's head were less than 6 inches apart. He had made harder shots in his life, but never one where, if he missed, what he would lose would be everything. The gunman turned his head toward Hudson, and that was his mistake. In the instant he turned, the angle between Maggie's temple and the man's forehead opened by another inch, and Hudson pulled the trigger. The bullet passed less than an inch from Maggie's cheek and struck the man square in the middle of the forehead. His body dropped like a sack of sand, dragging Maggie down with him, and his gun went off once into the wooden floor. Hudson lunged forward, ignoring the tearing pain in his abdomen, dropped to his knees beside his mother, and lifted her up. "Mom," he shouted, "are you hurt?" Maggie was breathing hard, her right hand pressed to her left arm, and when Hudson looked down, he saw blood already soaking through the sleeve of her sweater. "I'm all right," she said, her voice breaking now. "It only grazed me." Outside, the gunfire had gone silent, and Finn's voice rang out from the yard. "It's clean, boss. 4 dead, 2 got away." Hudson held his mother tightly on the splintered floor, strewn with glass, the 2 of them lying among the spent shells while the November wind poured through the shattered window, and he understood that from this moment on, he was no longer allowed even 1 more second of weakness. 40 minutes after the last gunshot died away in the lane, when Beckett Shaw had already arrived and treated the 4-inch wound on Maggie's left arm right there on the kitchen table, and Finn had dispatched 2 black trucks to clear away the bodies of the 4 Sterling men in the yard. An unmarked gray sedan stopped at the mouth of the lane, and a woman stepped out, alone. She was about 5'7", wearing a black leather coat down to her knees, gray trousers, and Oxford shoes with the heels worn down, and when she pulled a badge from the inner pocket of her coat, the streetlight caught the metal surface and lit up the 3 letters FBI with startling clarity. Finn saw her first and lifted a hand in warning, but she didn't stop, and she didn't draw a weapon either. She only kept walking toward the house with the calm green eyes of someone who knew exactly where she was stepping. "I'm Special Agent Quinn Lawson," she said when she stopped 3 paces from Finn. "New York office. I didn't come with backup because I can't trust my own colleagues, and I didn't come here to arrest anyone tonight. I need 10 minutes with Hudson Wakefield." Finn glanced toward the house, and Hudson, having heard from inside, stepped out onto the porch, though he had to brace himself against the doorframe just to stand. "Let her in, Finn," he said. Quinn Lawson was 38 years old. She sat down in the old armchair in the sitting room, where broken glass still covered the floorboards, and didn't show the slightest discomfort at the scene around her. And when Maggie came out carrying 3 cups of black coffee on a wooden tray, Quinn rose to her feet, bowed her head to the older woman, and thanked her in a low, respectful voice. Quinn placed a thick file on the table and opened it. "Mr. Wakefield," she began. "I've been tracking Von Sterling for 3 years. I lost 2 colleagues doing it. One died in Newark in April last year. One was killed in a car crash I don't believe was an accident. I'm not here because of your Wakefield family, because honestly, you're just one of many men I could spend an entire career chasing. I'm here because Sterling is something else." She turned the file and laid out a series of long-distance photographs. Vaughn, standing on a dock in Veracruz, shaking hands with a Mexican man no one at the table knew by name. Vaughn coming out of a warehouse in Laredo alongside 3 cargo containers. Vaughn standing in a law office in Manhattan, speaking with a federal prosecutor, whom Quinn had marked as under investigation for corruption. "He isn't just trafficking drugs and weapons," Quinn said, her voice never rising. "He's the central link in a human trafficking route moving people from the Mexican border into 9 eastern states. In the past year alone, we've counted at least 240 women and children moving through his network, most of them ending up in brothels or sold to trafficking families." Hudson sat still, his cold gray eyes having already passed through too much evil to be easily shocked, but his jaw had gone hard. Maggie set her coffee cup down, and for the first time in the meeting, she spoke. "So what do you want from my son?" Quinn looked at Maggie for a second, then turned back to Hudson and answered plainly. "I want you to testify. I have enough surrounding evidence to indict Vaughn for narcotics trafficking and organized criminal activity. But I need someone who sat at the same table with him, heard him speak, saw his books, to make the case on human trafficking and intentional murder. You're the only man left alive in that position. In return, the Department of Justice is prepared to offer a deal that I had to fight very hard to secure 2 weeks ago." Hudson lifted his eyes. Quinn went on. "Witness protection for you and your family. You won't have to change your name because your real name is already Henry Holloway. You'll only need to reclaim that identity. 2 years of house arrest instead of prison. You'll wear an ankle monitor and you won't be allowed to leave New York State. You'll surrender all assets derived from illegal operations, estimated at around $47 million, according to the bank records we currently hold. Full immunity from prosecution for offenses committed before the date you sign the agreement, except for murders with direct eyewitnesses, which you'll have to answer for one by one. That's the best deal you'll ever get in your life, Mr. Wakefield. If you refuse, I'll walk out of this house, and within 3 weeks Vaughn will kill you, and we'll be left to clean up both bodies." Hudson looked at Quinn for a long time, then turned to Maggie. She said nothing. She only placed her hand over his on the table. He turned back to Quinn and said, "I need 24 hours." Quinn nodded, rose to her feet, and gathered the file back into her bag. At the door, she turned once more and said, "Mr. Holloway, your mother has saved your life twice in 1 week. Don't let that become meaningless." The door closed behind her, and inside the wooden house in Red Hook, mother and son sat in silence among the broken glass, knowing that the decision Hudson would make in the next 24 hours would define the rest of his life. At 6 o'clock the following morning, after Finn had brought Noah back from Dolores Kavanaugh's apartment and 3 black SUVs were already waiting in the lane, Hudson made the first decision of the day in a voice that didn't allow argument. "We're leaving this house in 10 minutes, he said. "Sterling knows the address now. They'll come back, and next time it won't be 6 men. Maggie stood in the kitchen doorway, a scarf half folded in her hands, and looked around the wooden house where she had lived for 38 years, where she had buried a marriage, raised a child, lost him, and found him again. 1 minute later she nodded, said nothing, and began packing a few necessary things into the old canvas suitcase, the photo album, the small oak box, the passbook, the pictures of Patrick and Henry from the little altar. Noah was woken up, told that they were going away for a few days, and the boy only gave a sleepy nod, hugged his one-eyed teddy bear a little tighter, and asked no questions. By 7:30, the convoy had left Red Hook and crossed the Brooklyn Bridge heading north. And at 8:15 they stopped in front of the San Remo on Central Park West, a twin-tower limestone building that had stood there since 1930, where Hudson had bought an apartment on the 38th floor through a shell company 3 years earlier, and had never once set foot inside. When the elevator doors opened onto the 38th floor, Maggie stepped into a space she had never seen anywhere but in magazines at the barber shop. White oak floors stretched into a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows looking straight out over Central Park, with autumn trees in red and gold spreading like a great carpet, a cream-white leather L-shaped sofa facing a marble fireplace, and a ceiling 15 feet high hung with a Murano crystal chandelier. Noah let go of Maggie's hand, scampered into the sitting room, spun in a circle on the Persian rug, and burst into giggles. "Grandma!" he cried. "There's even a whole park inside the house." He ran to the window, pressed his nose against the glass, and asked if he could see the zoo, too. Maggie looked at him, smiled faintly, then turned back to the room like a traveler who had wandered into a museum she didn't wish to stay in for long. She set the suitcase down by the sofa, took off her coat, and said to Hudson, who was standing in the doorway, "It's beautiful, Henry, but I've lived 64 years without needing any of this, and I've still slept just fine." Hudson didn't answer. He took Noah into the smaller bedroom with the bed and study desk that had already been prepared, letting the boy discover the television and toy shelf Finn had sent people to buy the night before. Then he came back to the sitting room, sat down across from Maggie at the onyx coffee table, and said, "There's something I need to tell you." He told her everything about the meeting with Quinn Lawson, every term of the deal, from witness protection to the $47 million he would have to surrender, to the 2 years of house arrest, and the requirement that he account for each killing so the prosecutors could review them. He spoke for about 12 minutes, calm and precise, as if presenting a business deal, and when he finished, he looked at Maggie and asked the question he hadn't asked anyone in 16 years. "What do you want me to do, Mom?" Maggie sat still, her left hand still wrapped in bandages, and looked at her son for a long time before answering. "I can't answer that for you, Henry," she said. "I'm not the one who has to live with this decision. But if you want to know what I think, then I think you should do what Henry would do." Hudson gave a sad smile, one that carried the weariness of 20 years inside it. "I'm not Henry anymore, Mom. Henry was a 17-year-old boy washing dishes at Ferdinando's. I killed him the night I climbed into Sebastian's car." Maggie shook her head slowly, then placed her hand over his, her weathered hand covering the hand that had held far too many guns. "You're wrong, Henry," she said. "Your outer shell may have changed. Your name may have changed. The clothes you wear may have changed. But the child I gave birth to never went anywhere. He's still inside you. He's just been buried beneath too many layers of dust that you've thrown over him. I saw him in your eyes back in the house in Red Hook. I saw him when you fired that shot last night and your hand shook because you were afraid of losing me." Hudson lowered his head, and he closed his hand tightly around his mother's. From the bedroom inside, Noah's laughter drifted out together with the sound of the cartoon show he had managed to turn on by himself, and that sound was the only one in the enormous room besides the long breath Hudson finally allowed himself to let go. That night Hudson couldn't sleep. By 2 o'clock in the morning, he had already turned restlessly across the king-size bed in the master bedroom, 3 rooms away, and at last he threw the blanket aside, slipped his feet into the fleece-lined slippers, and walked barefoot across the white oak floor into the kitchen. He turned on the dim yellow light beneath the cabinets, put a kettle on to boil, and sat down on the high stool beside the white marble island, streaked with gray. 3 minutes later, as though she had heard his footsteps from the room at the far end of the hall, Maggie appeared in the doorway wearing the thick wool robe she had brought from Red Hook, her silver hair loosely tied at the nape of her neck. She sat down on the stool across from him and said nothing, only reaching for 2 chamomile tea bags from the box Finn had left there. They made tea in silence, and when the 2 white porcelain cups had been set between them, Hudson looked at the steam rising and began to speak. 20 men, Mom," he said, his voice low and even, like he was reading from a report he had known by heart for far too long. 20 men I ordered killed over the past 11 years. Not all of them died by my own hand, but all of them died because I spoke that word. The first was Tony Marchetti. In 2005, I was 26. He owed our family $600,000 and had run to Miami. I sent 2 men after him, and they found him in a small apartment with his wife, who was 6 months pregnant. He spoke slowly. Each name, each year, each reason, each consequence. One man named Rossi left behind 4 children in New Jersey. Another named Delaney cried and begged for mercy before he died. One more, named Kowalski, was never found because his body had been dumped into the East River. By the time he reached the 7th name, his voice had begun to crack, and by the 12th, he had to stop and drink water. Maggie never interrupted him once. She only looked at him through the steam rising from her tea, her eyes holding no judgment, no surprise, no fear, only something Hudson finally recognized as the pain of a mother listening while her son cut himself open before her eyes. When he reached the 20th name, a man called Marcus Whitlock, who had still been one of his captains just 4 days earlier and had been killed by Vaughn the following day because Hudson had directly allowed the betrayal to happen. Hudson stopped, laid his hand on the marble surface, and stared down at the table. "I don't know how many families were broken by my decisions, Mom," he said. "I don't know how many children tonight are asking their mothers why their fathers never came home. And the worst part is that until a week ago, I never even thought about that question." He closed his eyes. Maggie set down her cup of tea and reached across the marble to take his hand in hers. She didn't speak right away. She waited until his breathing steadied again. Then she said, her voice quiet but clear as something carved into stone, "Henry, you can't change the past. There isn't a single tear shed over this kitchen table tonight that can bring one breath back to those men. But you can choose the future. And if you choose rightly, then those 20 names won't be 20 names you carry down into your grave. There'll be 20 reasons for you to live the rest of your life differently. That's the only thing I can tell you." Hudson opened his eyes. He was about to answer when a small sound came from the hallway, the sound of bare feet on wood, and both of them turned. Noah stood in the kitchen doorway, his straw blonde hair sticking up on one side, his sleepy blue eyes still half closed, his right arm wrapped around the one-eyed teddy bear, his left hand dragging the corner of a blanket he refused to let go. "I heard Grandma's voice," he said softly, and he came closer, not walking toward Maggie as he usually did, but straight toward Hudson. Hudson went still for 1 second, then pushed back his chair, bent down, and Noah climbed into his lap as naturally as though he had done it every night of his life. He rested his head on Hudson's shoulder, tucked the teddy bear between their chests, and asked in a voice not fully awake yet, "Mister, are you going to stay with us?" Hudson couldn't answer right away. He looked at the boy's blonde hair, felt the feather-light weight of a trusting 7-year-old body in his lap, and when he finally managed to speak, his voice had broken. "I'm staying, Noah. I'm staying." Maggie looked at both of them through the steam rising from her tea, and for the first time in 20 years, her tears fell not from pain, but from something she had never dared to name. 3 days after Hudson signed the agreement with Quinn Lawson on the onyx coffee table in the San Remo apartment, the trap for Von Sterling had been prepared down to the smallest detail, and on the morning of the operation, Hudson brought Noah to Dr. Beckett Shaw's house in Bay Ridge. Beckett lived alone in a 2-story red brick house with a backyard full of tomato plants, and when Maggie told Noah not to bother the doctor and to eat all the vegetables at dinner, the boy only nodded, hugged his teddy bear tighter, and waved goodbye to the two of them through the window. Beckett closed the door, looked at Hudson, and said the only thing he felt needed saying, "Bring your mother and that boy back to me in one piece, Hudson." At exactly 10 o'clock that night, Container Pier No. 7 in Red Hook lay buried beneath the salty fog of November, the yellow-orange sodium floodlights spilling over the damp concrete in round pools of light spaced 100 feet apart, and between the rows of stacked containers rising like enormous blocks of steel, Hudson stood alone beside the black SUV, one hand in the pocket of his wool coat, the other hanging loose at his side, beneath his white shirt, beneath his gray silk tie, beneath the skin over his chest. A recording device no larger than a coin had been taped in place by Quinn with medical adhesive, and 300 meters away, inside a confiscated shipping container turned command post, 12 FBI agents and 6 SWAT operators were listening to every breath he took through their headsets. Von Sterling arrived at 10:04 in a black Escalade with bullet-resistant glass, stepped out with a smile already arranged on his face, and 4 bodyguards close behind him, including Ray Malone. "My boy survived," Vaughn said, opening both hands the way he had that night at Il Cardinale. "Good for you. For the past week, the whole city thought you'd rotted somewhere." Hudson gave a faint smile, shook his hand, and didn't pull away too quickly. "You planned it well, Vaughn," he replied, "but I want to talk. I've lost 3 captains. I don't have the strength to fight you back, and I don't want both of us burned to the ground in a war where the FBI gets the last laugh. I came here to split it." Vaughn nodded slowly, interested, and the 2 men walked along the row of containers. Vaughn's 4 bodyguards 3 steps behind him, Finn Barrett, and 2 of Hudson's men following him at the same distance. Hudson began talking about market share, about the northern route Vaughn had taken, about the possibility of working together in cross-border shipping. He praised Vaughn's Mexican network, and that was where he began to lead him, exactly where he wanted. "I know you've been working with Guadalajara for 4 years, he said, "since before Sebastian died." Vaughn laughed, took a sip from a silver flask, and answered, Sebastian was a fool, you know that. He thought he could control the whole South without sharing with anyone, and he paid for it. Hudson kept his face neutral. You arranged that. Vaughn nodded, surprised by the bluntness. That's right, he said. I paid $200,000 to a doctor at Mount Sinai to switch Sebastian's chemotherapy drugs during his last 3 months. He thought he was dying from cancer. He never knew the cancer had help. Hudson nodded. And Marcus Whitlock, he asked next. How long had you bought him for? Almost 2 years, Vaughn replied. Marcus was greedy, and you were too hard on him. I only paid him $50,000 a month, and your information flowed into me like water. Hudson could almost imagine the device beneath his shirt, growing hot against his skin. Inside the command container, Quinn clenched her hand. That's enough, she said quietly into the radio. Get ready to move. But at that exact moment, Ray Malone suddenly stepped forward from behind Vaughn, his eyes catching the slight bulge beneath Hudson's shirt on the right side of his chest, and he shouted, Boss, he's recording. Time stopped for half a second. Vaughn spun around, the smile gone, and his hand plunged into his coat for his gun. Hudson had already stepped back, the Glock at his waist snapping into his right hand, and the first shot exploded from Ray's weapon, grazing past Hudson's left ear. Finn Barrett, standing 20 feet behind, didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, throwing his body in front of Hudson as 3 more shots came in, and the second one buried itself in Finn's right shoulder, sending him crashing onto the concrete. Inside the command container, Quinn shouted into the radio, Go, now. From all 4 sides, 6 SWAT operators in black body armor surged out from behind the containers, red laser sights sweeping across the pier like a deadly web, and the loudspeaker thundered out the order, FBI, drop your weapons. Get on your knees. The whole firefight lasted less than 40 seconds. 2 of Sterling's bodyguards died on the concrete. 2 others were taken alive, and Vaughn Sterling, when he finally dropped his gun and sank to his knees in the middle of the orange floodlight, never took his eyes off Hudson. Hudson hadn't fired a single shot during the entire raid. He was already kneeling on the wet concrete beside Finn, his hand pressed hard over the wound in the man's right shoulder, and his loyal friend was grimacing through a crooked smile as he looked up at him. I'm all right, boss. I still owe you at least 3 more times taking a bullet for you. As the ambulance rolled away carrying Finn and the SWAT agents began clearing the scene, Vaughn Sterling was still kneeling beneath the wash of orange light, his hands bound behind his back with plastic restraints, and he was smiling. It was the same smile Hudson had seen that night at Il Cardinale, the smile of a snake that knew that even caught, it still had one last drop of venom left in its fangs. Hudson rose from the spot where Finn had just been lifted onto the stretcher and walked toward Vaughn, and Quinn Lawson, who was in the middle of ordering 2 agents to take him to the vehicle, raised a hand to stop them. She understood that this moment belonged to Hudson. Hudson looked at Vaughn for a long time, and at last Vaughn spoke. Before you go, my boy, he said, his voice soft as a whisper shared between old friends. Do you want to know one last thing? Something Sebastian took down into the grave with him, and something I've kept to myself for 11 years. Hudson didn't answer. Your father is still alive, Vaughn said. Hudson felt the air freeze solid in his lungs. Patrick Holloway lives in Clearwater, Florida, Vaughn went on, in a second-floor apartment in a retirement complex called Palm Shores. He's been there for 16 years. He was the one who authorized Sebastian to take you in 2006, my boy. Sebastian tracked him down in Florida and handed him $20,000 in cash, just to sign the papers and stay out of the way, while Sebastian's own men spent months stalking you to find your school and that diner, Ferdinando's. He sold his soul and his son's future for a brown envelope, using that blood money to secure the very Florida apartment where he's been hiding from his past ever since. Vaughn lifted his head and looked at Hudson, his smile stretching wider. I know this because Sebastian told me himself over drinks one night in 2010. He was proud of it. He said it was the cheapest deal he ever made. Time inside the harbor seemed to stop. Hudson didn't realize the Glock was back in his hand, and he didn't realize he had already raised it and aimed it at Vaughn's forehead. The distance was a little over 3 feet. His hand was shaking, not from weakness, but because everything inside his body was screaming a single word: shoot. For 16 years he had lived with the belief that his father was dead. 5 days earlier he had learned that his father was alive and had abandoned the family. And now, in the space of 15 seconds, he had just learned that his father hadn't only walked away, he had sold him to the man who built an entire empire of revenge on his back. Hudson's index finger tightened on the trigger, and the pressure had reached the point where only another third of a pound would have blown Vaughn's head apart. Quinn Lawson stood 5 meters away, her Glock already out of its holster, but she didn't raise it. She only said, her voice low and clear, "Mr. Holloway, he's already under arrest. You don't need to do this." Hudson didn't hear her. He heard another voice instead, the voice of a 64-year-old woman in the kitchen of the San Remo apartment the night before. "You can't change the past, but you can choose the future." He heard the voice of a 7-year-old boy clutching a teddy bear in his lap. "Are you staying with us?" He heard Finn breathing inside the ambulance. "I still owe you 3 more times taking a bullet for you." And he heard, from the deepest place inside his chest, a question Maggie had asked him 6 days earlier on the floor of the Red Hook sitting room. "And now, have you found what you went looking for, Henry?" Hudson's hand lowered. The gun fell back to his side, and he let out one long breath, as though he were breathing out all the darkness of 20 years. He turned his back on Vaughn and walked toward Quinn. "Take him away," he said. Vaughn shouted behind him, "Coward, why don't you shoot, Wakefield? Why don't you finish what you started?" But Hudson didn't turn around. He walked past Quinn, went straight to the black SUV, and when he sat down in the passenger seat, he placed the Glock slowly on the floor of the vehicle, the way a man sets down an object he will never pick up again. Quinn stood watching him, then said to the agent beside her, "That's the first time in 3 years of tracking this man that I've seen him not kill when he had the chance." 6 months after the night at Red Hook Harbor, on a May afternoon when Brooklyn was beginning to wake with the scent of lilacs drifting from the small yards along Beard Street, Henry Holloway stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in his hand and the black electronic monitor fastened around his right ankle. The 2-story wooden house had been repaired, not turned into anything luxurious, only made whole again, with the tin roof replaced, the sea blue paint on the outside boards restored in an even coat, and the eastern window no longer patched with tape and cardboard. Behind the house, in the 12-square-meter yard that had once been the place where the scrap cart was kept, there was now a small woodworking shop called Holloway & Son Woodworks, which Henry had opened 3 months earlier, with what remained after surrendering $47 million in Mafia assets to the Department of Justice. He made tables, chairs, and oak cradles for young families in the neighborhood, and the orders were enough to pay the electric bill and buy Noah a new pair of sneakers every school season. 2 months after signing the house arrest agreement, Henry had asked Quinn Lawson for permission to leave the state just once, and he had flown down to Clearwater, Florida, to see Patrick Holloway, 70 years old, frail from late-stage diabetes, living in the Palm Shores apartment whose address Henry had learned on the night at the harbor. Patrick opened the door with trembling hands, and when he saw his son's face, he couldn't say a single word. He only dropped to his knees on the wooden floor of the small apartment and wept. Henry stood still in the doorway. He had prepared every question during the 16-hour flight, but when he looked at the man who had sold him for $20,000 30 years earlier and saw only a thin old man with an oxygen tube beneath his nose, all of those questions disappeared. He said only one sentence. "I didn't come here to forgive you. I came so you would know that I survived without you." Patrick cried and repeated the word sorry more times than Henry could count. But Henry turned his back, walked down the stairs of the apartment complex, and never looked back once. On the flight back to New York that night, he closed his eyes and felt, for the first time in his life, that his chest had grown lighter. 1 year after signing the agreement, when Henry's record had been cleared and the name Henry Holloway had been officially restored on his birth certificate, the Brooklyn Family Court approved his petition to legally adopt Noah Holloway, and the 8-year-old boy stood before the judge, holding his one-eyed teddy bear, and answered her question in a clear voice. "I want to call him Dad." Finn Barrett opened a small Italian restaurant called Nana's Kitchen in Astoria, Queens, where he cooked every evening from the recipes of his Sicilian grandmother, and every Sunday he drove his old Ford across the Brooklyn Bridge to Red Hook for dinner with the Holloway family, bringing a box of cannoli and jokes that only Henry understood. That afternoon, when the May sun began to sink behind the harbor cranes, and the Brooklyn sky turned a blazing red-orange unlike any color in Noah's paint tubes, 3 generations sat together on the wooden porch. Maggie, 65 years old, sat in the wooden chair Henry had built for her, a cup of ginger tea in her hand, her silver hair neatly tied up. Henry sat on the step beside his mother, one leg stretched out to ease the weight of the monitor, and Noah ran around the yard with a golden dog named Scout that Finn had given him for his 8th birthday. the child's laughter ringing through the evening air like a kind of music this house hadn't heard in 3 decades. "Dad," Noah shouted from the yard. "Scout knows how to catch the ball now," and Henry smiled and called back, "Good job, son." Maggie placed her hand on her son's shoulder, and she said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Henry looked out toward the harbor, where the container ships were sailing away in the sunset, and he thought of all the empires he had built in blood, all the nights he had slept in a $300,000 bed without ever truly sleeping, and he understood that the true value of a life doesn't live in the numbers in a bank account, doesn't live in the name carved into the marble of a building in Manhattan, but in an afternoon like this, on a wooden porch in Red Hook, when a mother who lost her son for 20 years could finally hold the hand of the child who had come home, and when a boy the world had once left behind finally had someone to call dad. Henry Holloway's story is the story of a truth not many of us realize before it's too late, that the things we run from when we are young, poverty, a humble house, a mother who has nothing to give but love, are often the most precious things life placed in our hands from the very beginning, and that real success isn't what we build by leaving behind the people who love us, but what we are still able to hold on to after everything else has passed through us. There is no empire greater than a family still whole, no power stronger than a mother's arm waiting for us to return, and no bullet that can kill a person who has found himself again. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it made you think of someone in your life you haven't called in a long time, haven't sent a message to in a long time, haven't said sorry to or thanked in a long time, then please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with the people you think need to hear this story today. Leave a comment below and tell us your thoughts, your feelings after hearing this story. And if you have a story of your own about returning, about forgiveness, about a mother's love, we would be deeply honored to hear it from your heart in the comments. Our channel shares new moving stories every day, and every subscription, every like, every share is a great source of encouragement that helps us continue bringing you meaningful journeys like this one. Finally, we wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a peaceful life, joy in each day, and the blessing of always keeping your loved ones close. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.